Hello everyone, and welcome to this section on Netcat. So we're going to be using Netcat to establish connections to open ports as well as create listening ports on our end. So this becomes important with exploit development. So we need to determine how we're going to connect to a machine once we send an exploit and what type of shell we're going to use. So primarily we're going to be using Netcat throughout the rest of the course in terms of connecting to a machine or having a machine connect to us. And that's kind of what we're going to go over today, just the basics. So with Netcat, we are going to talk about connecting versus listening, so connecting to a port versus listening to a port. We're going to talk about bind shells, which is where an attacker connects to a victim on a listening port, and then reverse shells, which is the opposite. It's where a victim connects to an attacker on a listening port. So before we get started here, we need to download Netcat to our personal machine that we're running the VMware on, because we're going to use this demonstration between our Kali machine and our personal machine. So let's go out to Google. And for me, I use Windows, so let's go ahead and just look for Netcat Windows download. If you're running Linux or you're running Mac, you can try downloading for your machine here. So I'm going to go into this eternallybored.org, and I'm just going to download this Netcat 1.11, which comes in a zip file. So I've already gone ahead and downloaded that and unzipped it. And I've got this folder here with all my files. So right now, this is kind of where I want to stop. I just want to make sure that we have it on the machine. So once you have this ready, let's go ahead and go to our Kali machine. And we're going to get right into the terminal. So if you remember correctly, when we were covering our Keyoptrix machine in our enumeration section, we were using open ports and we were kind of enumerating those. So another way to kind of do that is we can use Netcat to see if we can establish a connection to an open port. So I still have Keyoptrix up. I'm going to use NC for Netcat, and then a switch of NV, and then I'm just going to type in the IP address here. And I'm going to pick a port. So I remember that port 443 HTTPS was open. Let's see if we can establish a connection to that. And we have. So that's all we're seeing here is it's open. We have a connection. We can try other ports here. We can try 80. That has a connection. I believe there was RPC bind. Also has a connection. So if we were to try something that there wasn't a connection for, we should get a refused message, and we do. So connection refused here. So this is a way to know if you're establishing any sort of connection here. And that'll be important later on. So these are just the basics. So on the opposite end of that, we're going to be doing listening as well. So in order to do listening, all we have to type in is NV again, but we're going to add LP for listening port. And then you pick a port number. So I like to go with 4444. You could pick whatever port number you want as long as it doesn't interfere with an open port you already have, and it doesn't interfere with your victim's machine. The only caveat I'm going to add here is that sometimes these ports are blocked by firewalls, or you have to use a very specific port depending on your exploit. But for now, 4444 is fine, and for 90% of your exploits, I believe 4444 will be fine. You could pick whatever port you want here. Just don't use something like port 80 or port 443, something you already have open on your machine. So now we are listening. So we're listening for any connection to come through. It's similar to this, but the opposite end of it. So if somebody were to Netcat to us on this open port, they would establish a connection. And that's what we're trying to get into here. So let's go right into our shells. So we've got a reverse shell and we've got a bind shell. So the reverse shell is when we get a victim to connect to us on a listening port. So now that we've already got this established, we can go ahead and go back to our personal machine, and we can make that victim connect to us. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this Netcat.mp4. And you don't have to type in the Netcat command line here, like the NC like this. You can just go straight into the command. So again, it's going to be -nv. And then we're going to connect to our Kali machine. So my Kali machine sits at 134.129. The port that we're connecting to is 4444. So this syntax should look familiar. It's just syntax we just used to connect to open ports on the Keyoptrix machine. So the only thing I'm going to add here is an executable. For me, for this being a Windows machine, I'm going to make it command.exe. So what happens is when I connect to my Kali machine on that listening port, the Kali machine is going to have full control of my command line. If you're using a Linux machine, it is bin bash as such. If you are on Mac, I cannot help you. I am not sure what the exact syntax is for that. You may have to look it up. So we're going to go ahead and choose command.exe, and hopefully we establish a connection here. So same thing, it's open, looks just like it did in our Kali machine. Now let's go look at what's happening on our Kali box. Okay, so we have a full connection. You see Microsoft Windows, all rights reserved. You're seeing a command line here. So this would be just like we were in the command terminal. So you could pull system information, you could say who am I. So you see this is Hawkeye's my computer name, the username's Heath. So a lot of information here we can dive deep into, but we have full root access to this computer now. So this is really what we're going to be doing throughout the course. It's just we're going to be running exploits against a machine and establishing this connection. So this will make a whole lot more sense in the next section when we cover buffer overflows and we write our own code to make this happen. So that's a reverse shell. So the bind shell is the opposite. It's where an attacker connects to us. Or sorry, we connect to an attacker or the victim on a listening port. So instead of us being the one who's listening, let's go ahead and Control C, and let's go back to our personal machine and open up Netcat again. We want this machine to be listening, so we want our victim to be listening, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the listening port 4444 just like we did before. And if we were going to be malicious and try to get a command line back, we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to do a command.exe. So now this is listening on port 4444, and when it gets a connection, it's going to send out command.exe. So if we go back to our Kali machine, all we have to do now is establish connection to that port. So my personal machine sits at 15.230. I establish connection to that port. Oops, it would be helpful if I type correctly. And there you go. I'm connected again. So that is a bind shell. So once again, reverse shell is where a victim connects to the attacker, and a bind shell is where the attacker connects to the victim. So try to remember those differences. Mainly we're going to be using reverse shells where we just set up listening on our machine and get an attacker or a victim to connect to us. But sometimes there's code that we're going to execute that is going to use bind shells. So be familiar with both and just get comfortable with both. So practice a little bit more with your machine and see if you can get comfortable before we start the next lesson. So that is it for this lesson. My name is Heath Adams and I thank you for joining me.